The extremities. Did you examine any of the extremities?
Yes, the extremities being arms and legs, yes, I examined both arms and both legs.
Okay. And on the right arm, how many injuries did you note?
I itemized 7 injuries on the right arm,
And how many on the left?
5.
Were any of them more problematic than any others, or?
Most of the injuries that I itemized on the arms are generally smaller bruises. There were also a few abrasions that I also noted.
Okay. Now, did you test an area of the right arm?
I may have. Yes, I have a sample of the right arm as well as the right forearm, as well as the left forearm.
Okay. And what did the microscopic examination tell you?
The left forearm skin sample that I have showed a lot of bleeding into the soft tissues underneath the skin as well as the muscles of the arm. Additionally, I saw all the bleeding there. Understand though that I found a fracture of the left arm too, so there was a lot of bleeding likely around the fracture.
I want to show you what's being previously admitted as states 465. What are we looking at in states 465?
Represents how I indicated that the pathologist has more options than just looking at the outside of the body to talk about even timing or things of that nature. We have the option of making an incision or cut in the skin and then seeing what things look like underneath. So again, pulling your covers back on your bed, you can see, okay, what does it look like on the other side? And so we're looking at the arm. This looks like the left arm. The forearm, there's a cut here that I've made, and this is the normal color of the fat in the skin when you cut it. This is bleeding, so there's likely a bruise that I saw on this side. You can see the bleeding just underneath there. The other option, though, is that I may not see something on the outside that clearly, and that's why we can see bruises at autopsy that that one may have not seen on the outside of the body, and that is the purpose of autopsy. So here's the bruise here. I can see the bleeding in the soft tissues after I make a cut, as well as on the wrist right here. So that's one of the things that pathologists will do is make cuts in the skin and reflect the skin and look at what it looks like on the opposite side.
Okay. And on the, did you find evidence of blunt force trauma when you, in the arms?
Yes, the bruises that I saw on the outer surface when I made the cuts in the skin, I did see the evidence of that on the other surface.
Did you also make any notes regarding the legs?
Yes.
And how many injuries did you note in the legs?
My report itemizes 9 injuries on the right leg and 8 on the left leg. And most of these were bruises. Some of them I describe as marks.
Now, I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 440. Is this one of the injuries that you observed at autopsy?
Yes, this is the inner part of the right thigh, and here is this somewhat irregular shaped pattern of bruising. It's mostly red and purple. There's some abrasion along with it on top of it. So this is a bruise with abrasion. That's on the inner part of the thigh, right thigh.
And is this one of the injuries that you noted?
Yes, sir.
Microscopically, did you look at any of the injuries on the legs?
Microscopically, yes. I have a skin sample from the back of the right thigh, from the right leg and foot, and from the left thigh.
just going through these quickly. Not every single thing that you saw at autopsy may have been inflicted from abuse, correct?
That's correct.
And states 433, is something like this bruise right here, could that have been from, say, child's play?
Yes, so this would be when we talk about locations of injuries. Here is a smaller bruise on the front part of her leg. These are typical areas that kids have bruises on the front part of their legs.
I'm going to show you states 447. What are we looking at in stage 447?
This is the inner, so this will be the left side. Here, the inner part of the left thigh has this bruise with abrasion. There's also actually, let's change that. I think the body is upside down. Let me see the picture.
Sure.
Because this is the injury that we just saw. So this is the right leg because the body's turned over. So this is an injury that we just saw, this very irregular pattern bruise with abrasion from the back side. So on the inner side, it extends to the back of the thigh. Also on the outer portion of this right thigh, there was a bruise.
And states 452. Is the bruise that we're looking at in this picture right here, the forefront, is that on the other leg from the one we just looked at?
Yes, so this is the left leg. You can see better in this picture that the body is laying on the front side, because here's the knee face down. This is the back of the left thigh. There's a bruise on the back of the left thigh.
Did you see evidence of blunt force trauma on Layla's legs?
Yes, the bruising is the evidence of blunt force trauma. A bruise is a blunt force injury category.
Doctor, you had mentioned previously that you had incised the scalp, and you kind of explained to us how you did that, correct?
Yes, I did.
All right. I want to go ahead and show you what's been previously marked as states 454. I'm going to show you a photograph of the incised scalp, okay? What are we looking at, if you can describe what we're looking at here?
What we're looking at here is after we've made a cut right along the top of the head from ear to ear, then of course the front part of the scalp is pulled forward, the back is pulled backwards. Again, in this analogy of sheets going pulled back. And now we can see this is the front of the head, this is the back of the head. We're seeing the inside surface of the front here to our left. All of this is all this red areas. The scalp should look a little bit more like this, very tan gray color. We have a lot of yellow color here. That's abnormal. We've already seen that some of the bruises were older, and so that's why some of it is looking yellow. And then a lot of this red is fresh bleeding. It's rather extensive. This right here is a muscle of the temporal part of the scalp. It's called the temporalis muscle. So the bleeding is also into the muscle as well. That means that it's deeper than just the thickness of the skin.
I'm going to show you what's been entered as states 455. What are we looking at in states 455?
This is this same skin reflected area. So here's the cut line. So this means that this is on the middle. And as we go inside, this is the front. So the eyes would be right here. So this is the frontal scalp, the forehead would start above there, and this is going towards the top of the head. So I mean, there's just numerous areas of bleeding on the scalp here. All of this it's in the middle, it's on the sides, it's deep enough to affect the muscles. So we're seeing the extent of the bleeding in her scalp that, if you remember looking at the outside doesn't look this bad. We don't really see all this on the outside. And so this is how you can see a lot more on the inside than you can see on the outside.
Now, how many areas did you note of hemorrhage when you incised the scalp?
Again, I categorize this as my incised scalp in terms of the area that I described. And I have 8 separate areas listed. I should say 8 separate numbers listed. But again, each number, some of this is just the area. It's not counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 1 may be all of this. Number 2 may be, let's cluster these together. Number 3 may, so things are like, let's cluster number 1, as opposed to really being able to count every single isolated area because it's so extensive.
Now, the injury that you saw when you incised Layla's scalp, is that consistent with accidental trauma?
Well, no, not the extent of it. Most of this entirety of the front part of her scalp has numerous bruises. In the realm of even thinking about a 2-year-old and the type of things that happen to them from falling or bumping or the type of things they do. I mean, I have 4 children, so this is completely out of the realm of, oh, that's probably just from the 2-year-old falling down or jumping into bed. These are outside of the realm of being logically consistent with accidental trauma in a 2-year-old.
And you said that the different colors or hues let you know that these likely occurred at different times, correct?
Yeah, and then we've already talked about some of the samples that I already looked at in the microscope that confirmed that.
What type of mechanism could cause injury like this?
They're bruises, so they're blunt impact injuries. Impact to the scalp causes bruises of the scalp. And impacts, impacts, I'm sure everyone is kind of obvious. Impacts may be the stationary head being hit with something or the head in motion hitting something.
Doctor, we had talked a little bit about your internal examination. You did not find any signs of chicken anywhere in the body, correct?
No, the airway at the time of autopsy was a normal airway that did not have any foreign objects, whether that be food or any other objects in there.
Did you make a notation or did you observe any injury to the internal organs of the body?
Yes, I observed several injuries to internal organs.
Now, what is the thymus?
The thymus is an organ that sits right over the heart when you first make an incision in the body and the chest. When you remove the chest cavity, the thymus sits right over the heart.
And did you find any injury to the thymus?
I saw bleeding in the thymus, yes.
And what could that be consistent with?
Again, with bruises, we talked about bruises on the external surface of the body, but internal organs can also be bruised. And so when you have impacts that are forceful enough to injure the internal organs of the body, you see, again, the blood vessels have been disturbed and disrupted, and then the blood comes out of the vessel, and that's, you see the bleeding into the tissues of the organ. And those are blunt force injuries.
Do you normally see that type of injury associated with CPR?
With the thymus, and as much as it does sit right over the heart, you can see some hemorrhage in the thymus with CPR because that's obviously that is a impact when you're doing compressions. Typically with CPR, since it's being done to a person that is either near death or has, is very near death, the blood in the heart is not pumping very well, so you don't really see a lot of bleeding into the tissues. But I saw a significant amount of bleeding in the thymus.
Given the fact that you saw a significant amount of bleeding in the thymus, would that be consistent with CPR?
I would say it would be consistent with compressions in a person that does not have a very strong heartbeat.
What would it be more consistent with, say, being punched in the chest?
It could be consistent with being punched in the chest, yes, when in a person who's not near death and their heart is beating well and they're alive and they've been punched in the chest.
I want to show you what. Well, let me ask you this: Did you When you did the examination, did you extract any blood from Layla's abdomen?
When I did the examination, Layla had blood in her, free blood in her abdomen. That means that she was bleeding internally from injuries that were identified at autopsy, and I did collect that blood and I measured it.
I'm going to show you states 457. Is that the blood that you collected from Layla?
Yes, that's in a measuring cup, and it shows that there was 150 cc's of just free blood in the abdominal cavity.
And roughly how much would that have been of her blood from her body?
So for a child of this age and weight, she probably has about a liter of blood circulating in her body. 150, and that makes the math easy. It's about 50% of her, a liter is 1,000, this is 150. That's 50% of her blood volume is free in her abdominal cavity.
Did you make any findings regarding her liver?
Yes, I did. She had a liver laceration.
And tell us a little bit about how people can get liver lacerations.
You get liver lacerations with significant amount of blunt impact to the abdomen that then causes the liver to tear in certain areas. We see liver lacerations frequently in motor vehicle accidents, other injuries, significant forceful punches to the stomach area, or I should say abdomen, not necessarily stomach. That's when you see liver injuries. Impacts to the abdomen cause the liver to be injured.
And are there a lot of blood vessels in the abdomen? I'm
Yes.
sorry, the liver I meant.
Yes.
Okay.
The liver is a very vascular organ. It has two different sources of blood flow, and so it's quite vascular.
I'm going to show you what's admitted as states 464. What are we looking at in states 464?
This is a photograph now of the internal aspect of the autopsy. After all of the external is done, the injuries documented for the external, then to proceed with the internal examination, a Y-shaped incision is made in the chest and abdomen. The chest plate is removed. So here is the cut line along the ribs, just for orientation. This is the chest cavity. Right here in the middle is the heart. Off to the sides are the lungs. There's a diaphragm. There's the muscle that separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. And just underneath the diaphragm on the right side is the liver. And the liver takes up all of this upper part of the right side of the abdomen and extends over a little bit towards the left as well. Of course, the liver is an organ that's all one piece. And in this photograph, you can see the split, the cut, or the laceration, in medical words, in the liver. And that's where the injury is.
Now, did you see anything as far as did you do any microscopic examination?
Yes, sir, I did.
And when you did your microscopic examination, did it tell you anything else about any injuries to the liver?
Yes, it did.
And what did it tell you?
So interestingly, when I did the microscopic of the liver area where it was injured, I see a lot of the fresh blood. It's a fresh injury. Once something is injured, you're going to see the blood there. I saw neutrophils already. So that means that, okay, some neutrophils, the body's trying to heal itself already. So it didn't just happen like 10 minutes ago. The body, the neutrophils are coming in, they want to heal it. The liver tissue, I saw it dying already. That's called necrosis. I started seeing that. That takes a little bit of a time frame as well. The other thing I saw, though, in addition to all these acute injuries in other areas of ventricular liver, was evidence that the liver had been injured before. I saw some features of a healing of the liver tissue. I saw a lot of iron macrophages so I saw evidence that she previously had injury to the liver. And that, at least from all the historical information that I received, had never had any type of medical attention of the liver injury before. So this was an injury that had gone unseen by any medical doctors, but I identified, hey, this liver's been injured before. There's a lot of iron here. This starting to heal, which the body will do. And then I saw this very acute liver injury that accounted for the blood in the abdomen. It didn't happen 10, 15 minutes ago because the body is already ready to react to it. There's neutrophils there. The liver cells are dying. And so she had evidence of an acute or fresh injury. And I previously mentioned maybe an hour, within maybe 40 minutes to a little over an hour. And then something old, maybe a few days old, a couple weeks, maybe a week.
Okay. So for the liver, the liver injury, your microscopic examination showed it was probably about 40 minutes to an hour at least since that injury had been inflicted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say like within an hour, give or take a few, but then not really far beyond that. Because once you start going beyond an hour, 2, 3 hours, this is a person that then would have, with no medical attention, would have manifested the symptoms of the blood loss and things of that nature much sooner than that. So we're talking about an hour or so.
Now, you mentioned that the liver is very vascular. Did this contribute to the amount of blood that was free in Layla's abdomen?
Yes, absolutely.
You also mentioned the healing trauma. And let me ask you this, because you found what exactly did you find as far as the healing trauma?
I saw the iron pigment, the hemosiderin, a lot of that, and I saw what we call fibrous type tissue starting to react. That's as things get older, when an organ starts to heal, you start having fibrous tissue reactive changes.
Now, how quickly do liver lacerations heal in general?
Well, the liver is quite an organ that particularly because of the blood supply that it has a very rich blood supply from 2 type of separate channels, and it regenerates itself very quickly. That's one of the characteristic features of a liver. It's really regenerative. And typically they're going to heal very quickly, more so than other organs in the body.
Okay, so because the macrophages are there, it would be at least 2 days old, is that correct?
It would be at least that. Yeah, everything that I saw in the previous liver injury, we're probably talking about several days, maybe a few weeks. Maybe.
Let me ask you on the back end. Would you expect this injury to still be present or seen by you if it was, say, 3 to 4 months old?
Oh, no, sir. The liver would be well healed. You wouldn't be able to tell anything after 3 to 4 months, particularly in a 2-year-old. Even their bones are completely healed after much sooner than that. So the liver, I would expect to see nothing. It would just look like a normal liver after probably a month. So a liver would look normal. You would never be able to tell there was an injury before.
You mentioned something about kids healing. Do kids heal at different? Can children heal at different rates than, say, adults?
Yes, it's quite well recognized that children will heal quicker than adults.
Now, is the injury that you saw consistent with, say, getting punched in the stomach?
Which injury?
The liver laceration.
Yes.
Yes, the acute one.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a blunt force injury, being kicked or hit or something hitting, whatever, struck the abdomen, lacerated the liver.
Now, do you see liver injuries frequently in the context of child abuse?
Yes, in the context of inflicted trauma to children, yes. The most common type of injuries that you see in what we refer as child abuse is head trauma. Then abdominal trauma is the second most common, and with abdominal trauma, the liver is one of the organs that is frequently injured.
Now, did you also make any findings regard to Layla's pancreas?
Yes, I did.
And I'm going to show you what's been admitted as states 459. What are we looking at in states 459?
For orientation purposes, here you can see the cut edges of the ribs as they extend down into the abdomen portion below the diaphragm. This is the liver up here. It's to our left here in the picture, where the liver I've held up the liver a bit. On the opposite side is the stomach, and I've held the stomach up because the pancreas is an elongated organ that sits somewhat right above the vertebrae, and it's behind the stomach, it's behind the liver, it stretches across there, and it's an organ that's one piece, it's one organ. So the pancreas kind of would extend right along here, from about here to there. This is one half of the pancreas, and this is the other half of the pancreas because it was injured and it was lacerated until it's separated into two pieces. And so we're seeing the separation of the injured pancreas. This is called a transection. That's the word that's used in my report, that the pancreas was transected, separated into two pieces.
Dr. Darrisaw, I'm going to show you what's been previously marked as State Exhibits 473, 474, and 475. Would these exhibits aid you in explaining some of the concepts we're talking about to the jury?
Yes. Probably it's best to kind of go in the order where you see it 474, then 75, and back to 73.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I'd move 473, 474, and 475 as evidence is demonstrative.
Admitted.
Dr. Darrisaw, what are we looking at in States 474?
So this is a good diagram that shows where the organs are in the body if you look at them on the inside. Here's the liver, it sits up in the right upper part of the abdomen. The stomach sits in the left, kind of curves around. Here, coming from the top, the esophagus comes down, food comes into the stomach. The intestines take up the large amount of the abdomen. The large intestine kind of comes across like this. All of this is small intestine. The pancreas hides behind all this. And this diagram is shown, obviously the stomach isn't see-through, but just for the purposes of showing this, it's behind it. And you can see it stretching across there. So in my previous picture that we just saw, I don't remember which exhibit number it was, of Layla, I had to hold the stomach up, because of course we can't see through it like here. I held it up, I held up the liver, then we could see the pancreas, and the pancreas should be one elongated organ. Layla's pancreas was split in two.
I'm showing you States 475. What are we looking at in States 475?
So in this diagram, it's like a cutaway of just seeing, let's just look at where the pancreas is when we have everything cut away. The back of the body and the vertebrae would be there. In front of it, you see all these blood vessels. The kidneys are back here. The spleen sits over to the left side. And here's where the pancreas stretches across, and it kind of stretches across underneath stomach, liver, and it kind of stretches across right over the vertebrae. And so very forceful punches to the abdomen in that upper abdominal area. If there's a hard enough punch, since the pancreas is right there over the vertebrae, that's how it gets, that injury from punch from the inside and the vertebrae right there, you can cause a laceration.
I'm going to show you what's been admitted as States Exhibit 473. Does this diagram aid you in assisting how Layla got injured?
Yeah, so this is a diagram that shows that. This would be the back. Here's a vertebral body outline. This is the front of the body. So here's the liver. We see cut portions here, demonstrating in the little cartoon, the kidneys here, the pancreas stretches here. So in this diagram, they're showing the arrows representing a force coming into the abdomen. This force coming in along this line, it can lacerate the liver, it can lacerate the pancreas where it separates into two, because once all of this gets compressed, you're going to have this impact on the vertebrae that's right there. And so you're going to have to come very forcefully or back for all this tissue to go internally and separate the pancreas, lacerate the liver.
Now, can the pancreas be injured in an accidental manner?
Yes, it can.
What's the most common way that it's injured in an accidental manner?
Most common accidents, particularly I'll talk about children, is bicycle handle injuries. And so with my children, the trauma surgeons or the ER physicians, they see the children that come in with abdominal pain, and once they do CTs and x-rays, they can see that a liver may be injured. And the typical story may be, oh, they're on a bicycle, maybe they fall, and that handlebar comes directly internally and hits in that particular place to lacerate the pancreas. So those are what you see typically in the literature. That's what the doctors in the hospital see, bicycle handle injuries.
Now, are pancreas injuries in and of themselves, are they normally fatal?
They're typically not normally fatal. If you look at the literature from trauma literature, emergency room doctors, trauma surgeons, most pancreas injuries, particularly when there are these bicycle injuries, they're isolated, only the pancreas is injured. The pancreas is not the most vascular organ in the abdominal cavity. It has a lot of enzymes and there will be pain, but most pancreas injuries, if they're isolated, there's no fatal outcome. They are, a lot of times they're not even subjected to surgery. They watch them in the hospital, let the pancreas heal, and then they go home. If there's polytrauma, a lot of other injuries along with the pancreas, there can be some morbidity and mortality, but most pancreas isolated injuries are non-fatal.
Now, you mentioned pain. Would this type of injury be painful?
Yes, they're painful. These kids that have the bicycle injuries or other typical accidental mechanisms of pancreas injuries or liver injuries, they're painful, and that's how they present to the hospital with abdominal pain.
And you also mentioned the term polytrauma. Would Layla fall into the category as having polytrauma regarding her abdomen?
Layla definitely falls into the category of polytrauma, not only as it relates to her internal injuries, but also her external injuries. There's trauma, extensive trauma, externally and internally, so she is in the category of a child with polytrauma.
You also mentioned that she had damage done to the mesentery, correct?
I think you mentioned that.
Okay.
She does.
And I'm going to show you what's been marked as states 458. What are we looking at in states 458?
So the mesentery is just all of these supporting tissues of the intestines. The intestines, obviously, you know the intestines to be prolonged tubular structures. That's where all of our waste goes through. But they're not just hanging loose. They have all this supporting structure. So it would be similar to like thinking of all the webs between your fingers that hold the intestines together. It's called the mesentery. So here I have lifted up the large intestine, and all of this soft tissue that connects it together is called either the mesentery, or as it relates to the large intestine, the mesocolon. These are lacerations in that tissue. It should be all one piece. So these are the tears from the trauma. This is all the blood, so there's bleeding into the mesenteric tissues and tears. And one thing with the bleeding internally, I collected 150 fresh blood, but then there's all this blood just in the soft tissues that you can't collect that and squeeze that out. So she's got a lot of bleeding in the soft tissues, and she had the fresh blood that's all just loose in the abdominal cavity.
Now, is the mesentery, is that part considered part of the small intestine?
Yes, it's considered part of the small intestine and also the large intestine as well. Typically, with the large intestine, we use the word mesocolon, but both of those are the supporting structures of the intestines.
Now, I want to talk about when this polytrauma was inflicted. What would be the signs and symptoms that someone around the child would have seen?
The injuries that Layla has are in the category of non-impact injuries. The one impact injuries are most significantly to the abdomen. And so as I talked about before, she has a liver laceration. She has lacerations of all the supporting structures of the small and large intestine. She has her pancreas transected. This would cause abdominal pain. So it causes abdominal pain. It's not going to cause immediate death because That's just the nature of abdominal trauma. You're not going to die immediately just because your liver is lacerated. You can still walk, nothing has injured that, but you're going to have a lot of abdominal pain. Over time, as this bleeding starts accumulating, that's when you're going to start having the signs and symptoms of losing blood. You're not getting enough oxygen to your brain. So that's when the seizures, your body is basically starting to go into shock. And that's what shock is. Your body is going into shock, it's losing blood, you become pale, and then as in the description that I talked about, the description of Layla moving her arms and legs at the table and her head going back and her eyes going back and back of her head, those are the symptoms that she's having of having this abdominal trauma. She's losing blood, she's been injured. And so now she's going into shock, she's starting to die, she's having this choking type thing. It's not because of a foreign body or a piece of chicken in her airway, it's her choking and not breathing and having a seizure because she has abdominal trauma.
Now, as far as I know you mentioned a little bit about the timing. Do you believe, when in relation to her death, do you believe that this type of injury would have been inflicted?
Within about an hour. Could be a little, give or take maybe some minutes, hour, 15 minutes, 40 minutes. I mean, you can't be exact. But of course, as I've already mentioned, parts of her body are already starting to heal. She has neutrophils in the liver already. So this just didn't happen 10, 15 minutes ago. The body has been injured. It's starting to heal. All the cells in the body are saying, hey, I've been injured. Let me get there and try to start healing you, liver. And so that's what's happening. So we're talking about a little bit of time. And then, of course, we're talking about the time for her to then eventually start having the symptoms of her losing 15% of her blood volume. And then, so that takes a little bit of time, at least probably half an hour.
And types of things that you mentioned, a stomp and a kick or a punch, these are the types of things that could cause this type of injury, correct?
Yes. Force will punch your abdomen and stomp. Given all of the injuries that she had, inclusive of her back and her head, we would be considering that she didn't just have one single impact that caused the extent of all of her injuries involving the entirety of the body.
Now, in the abdominal area, we actually don't see any bruising in that area, correct? On the external part of the body?
For the most part, obviously we saw some of the bruises on the lower abdomen, the right and left sides, and on the side of the hip and the pubic area, but at least right in the middle where the liver would be, as you saw in the diagram, no, there wasn't any bruising there.
And is it unusual not to find external bruising in the abdominal area?
So that's not unusual at all. Very frequently, when you have liver lacerations, which are a lot more common than pancreas injuries, it's quite interesting and fascinating that you don't see any bruising on the outside, and that's because of the phenomenon of the skin itself that compresses and injures the internal organs, whereby the skin, because it's stretched all the way in, you're not causing the blood vessels of the skin to be injured. So a bruise you can only see when the small vessel is just in the skin break. With the abdomen, once a punch or a stump comes through the skin goes all the way in, the organs inside are injured, but the skin vessels are not. So that's quite common to have very significant internal injuries of the abdomen with liver lacerations and not have the external abdomen appearing to have a bruise.
We've talked a lot about protected areas. Showing you states 475. Is the pancreas considered to be a protected organ?
Yes.
And why is that?
Particularly given it's behind the stomach, it's behind the head of it, it's a little bit behind the liver. It's over the vertebrae that kind of protects it because the bone protects it there. It's the very specific type of impact in the epigastric area that's going to cause the pancreas to be injured. And so they're not injured frequently, at least it's not in my experience to see many pancreas injuries outside of very significant force directly in that area.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned we talked about some of the other organs. The spleen, is the spleen actually more likely to get injured than, say, the pancreas?
Yes, the spleen is more likely to be injured than the pancreas. The spleen sits in the upper left side of the body, and it's kind of just still underneath the skin. So you don't have bone over it covered in. The spleen is one of the more common organs that is injured in traumatic cases where we're talking about motor vehicle accidents.
Now, as far as Layla's nourishment, did you ever make any finding regarding whether or not she was malnourished or anything like that?
No, one of the things that we do at autopsy is obtain a height and weight. That's part of the autopsy procedure. Layla's weight was in the 10th percentile. Her height was in the 90th percentile. I haven't calculated that body mass index, but that would be in the most likely the general range of a normal body mass index. It's not outside of her being like less than 30 percentile or something like that. So.
Okay. Now, the adrenals, did you find any, well, first of all, what are the adrenals?
The adrenals are endocrine organs. They make enzymes, and they sit right above the kidneys. So you have the kidneys, and on each side of the adrenals, sort of a flat organ that sits right over the adrenals.
Did you find any evidence of trauma to the adrenals?
Not specifically to the adrenal itself, but there was hemorrhage or bleeding around the adrenals, and that was just reflective of the fact that she had abdominal trauma, significant abdominal trauma. There was a lot of bleeding in the abdominal area, and the soft tissues around the adrenals had bleeding around it.
Now,
And I don't know if that was both adrenals or one or the other. I'd have to look.
showing you states. .463. Did you make any findings regarding the heart?
Yes, I did.
And if you can orient us, where is the heart on the screen behind you?
In this photograph, this is the heart rate. So what I found on the heart was this injury that is in the photograph and also one that is not in the photograph. What we see in the photograph here, this is obviously the front part of the heart. This is a small area of bleeding into the surface, just the very superficial surface of the heart.
Could that injury in and of itself possibly be consistent with a CPR?
Now, this is in fact an injury that we may see in CPR, whether that be in a child or in an adult, because it's, number one, is very small amount of bleeding around it. And this would be reflective of the fact that in CPR, you're dying, your heart is not beating very fast, but you're trying to pump the blood in the heart. So with chest compressions, you may cause a break in the blood vessel. Since there's not any very significant blood pressure because you're dying, you see very small bleeding around it. And so that would not be unusual to see in CPR. Not like what we saw in the liver and all the hemorrhage or bleeding that we saw in the mesentery. That would be quite inconsistent with a heart that's not beating very well.
And did you also make any findings regarding the diaphragm?
Yes, I did.
I'm going to show you 461. What are we looking at here?
In the top of this picture here, this is the photograph of the lung. And so the diaphragm is the muscle that separates the chest cavity, the heart and lungs, from everything in the abdominal cavity. This is, we refer to it either as the dome or the leaflet of the diaphragm. Looking at the top portion, it's a muscle, so this is what it kind of generally looks like. All of this is bleeding, so bruising of the diaphragm. So that's where all the injury is that involves the diaphragm.
And would this be an injury that you would expect to see from CPR?
No, sir.
Or the Heimlich?
No.
Did you also examine the bones in her body?
Yes, I did.
And as far as the right ulna, the left ulna, did you make any findings?
Yes, I did.
And what were your findings?
Number one, the one thing that we did at the time of autopsy, which is quite normal practice in child autopsies, particularly of a certain age, typically under 1 or sometimes under 2, depending on what we see, is to do full body x-rays. So full body x-rays were done on Layla. I saw those before I started. And so in the x-rays, I did identify that she had a fracture of the left ulna as well as the right tibia. So then at the time of autopsy, to further evaluate that fracture, I removed the bone.
Okay. I'm showing you what's 460, been entered as 467.
And so this is after I have removed this injured bone. You can see the fracture through there. And I took samples of that to look at on the microscope. This was a healing fracture of the bone.
Now, just so we're clear, this is the arm bone? The ulna is in the arm, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, you said that you did a microscopic examination of this injury?
Yes, I did.
Now, what did you find when you did a microscopic examination?
What I found when I did a microscopic examination was that the bone was, I would refer to it as advanced healing. I started to see new bone already. So when a bone heals, again, the body wants to heal itself. I didn't have any indication that, I don't believe that this was a bone that had previously been known to have a fracture. So the body is trying to heal the bone itself. First, you're going to start having more cartilage laid down, and then the bone is going to start to form. The bone initially is like very immature bone, and then you start seeing a mature bone, and then the body will heal itself into a normal bone. At the stage that I saw this fracture in, I'm already seeing the immature bone, so it's quite advanced along the way, probably at least a couple of weeks.
Now, on the back end, would you expect this fracture to be, say, several months old?
No, sir.
And why is that?
Well, in a 2-year-old, most of the bones should be completely healed, even without any medical attention, in about a month or a couple of months. The body is going to just completely heal the bone.
In a 2-year-old, if several months had gone by, could you not even see any signs of the fracture ever being there?
If it's several months, you potentially may not, but it kind of really also depends on what bone it is, and if there's a lot of movement of the bone, it may heal completely, and where at least if you look at it in a microscope, it looks like mature bone and it's fine, but sometimes if people don't have bones casted, there may be a deformity of the bone. And so it kind of all depends on how much movement and whether there's going to be a deformity after it's completely healed.
I want to talk to you about the right tibia. The tibia is in the leg, correct?
That's correct. One
And
of the lower leg bones.
did you also do a microscopic examination of the tibia?
Yes, I did.
And what were your findings?
The tibia as well had what I refer to as advanced healing. There was immature bone already present. So it's along the advanced stage where it's healing to the point of maybe in the next few weeks it would have been completely healed.
All right. Did you make note of any other fractures that Layla had?
Yes, I did.
And what was that?
I found a healing fracture of one of the right ribs. Please the 8th. Let's confirm. Yes. I found a healing fracture of the right 8th rib.
I'm going to show you what's been admitted as stage 468. What are we looking at in stage 468?
What we're looking at here we can see the ribs on the right side. The ribs, when you look at them, they're kind of flat. I mean, they're bone, of course, but they have this flat, smooth appearance if you rub your hands along them. Here you can see a little nodular bulging of this rib. You see these very smooth. You come along here, this is towards the back side of the rib cage. This is posterior. You come along, you see this little bump. And then you get back to the smoothness. This little bump is where a fracture was. It started to heal, and this is what's called the callus formation of the fractured bone.
Now, is that similar to what you saw in the other fractures that we've talked about so far?
Yes, this was a healing fracture of the posterior or the back part of the right deep rib.
Now, how does this type of fracture occur?
This type of fracture would occur by forceful squeezing, such that when you squeeze the rib cage, those ribs towards the back, you can fracture it. And if it's, the ribs just heal themselves. It's not like you put a cast on the rib or anything like that. So it heals itself, and as it goes through this progression of healing, it starts with the bones being a little bit thicker, nodular, callous, and it'll smooth out over time, especially in a 2-year-old, and it'll look normal after about a month or so. But at this point, it's in the healing stage.
Now, this is a posterior rib fracture,
Yes,
correct?
the back of the ribs.
Now, is a posterior rib fracture highly indicative of child abuse?
Posterior rib fracture is certainly something that makes one very concerned that the mechanism was very forceful squeezing.
Now, you talk about the timing. About how old would this fracture have been?
A few weeks.
You also took x-rays at the autopsy, correct? I think we've talked about that.
X-rays were taken. With the x-rays, we take the x-rays primarily to see what the bones look like. We also take x-rays in gunshot wound cases to look for bullets. In children, it's primarily for looking at the bones because we otherwise would not see them. In the x-rays, I did see the fracture of the arm. I saw the fracture of the leg. The x-ray, I didn't see the fracture of the rib. It's only the one in the back, so that's why the autopsy is done. I'm able to see rib fractures a lot more than just myself when I remove all the organs. So the rib fractures, when we don't see them in our x-rays, we're still quite confident that we will see them because we remove all the organs.
Dr. Darrisaw, I'm going to show you what's been admitted to states 470. What are we looking at in states 470?
What we're looking at here is, in this particular case, and in most child autopsies, particularly at younger than a certain age, in the removal of the organs, we take them out all in one piece. Most of the adult autopsies, that's one difference in the adults, is that you take out the organs just one at a time. Take out the heart, then the lungs. With the children, take out everything all in one piece. So everything, her tongue will be up here with all of this taken out. You can see the lungs, the heart, the liver, see how things are all pieced together. So that's just what is referred to as the stomach is coming here. Lift up the stomach, which I did when everything was shown, when it was still inside the body. You have to lift all that up to be able to see that.
And on the back side, we're looking at states 471.
And this is just the whole organ, complete organ block as it was removed, turned over. You don't see the pancreas here either. This is the diaphragm. You can see a lot of the bleeding here, just at these. And then, mind you, this is after everything's been cleaned up. After I've taken it out, I've cleaned it up. I mean, I've even cleaned, you don't even see blood in the background. But you can see the blood in the mesenteric tissues. Some of the blood, here's the diaphragm, that's blood that you saw in the diaphragm.
Dr. Darrisaw, are you familiar with the Heimlich maneuver?
Yes, I am.
Okay. In your medical opinion, could the injuries that Layla sustained, or the injuries that Layla sustained, had, are they consistent with the Heimlich maneuver?
The injuries?
Yes.
No, she had extensive injuries. Her liver is lacerated, her pancreas is lacerated to the point that it's split in two, it's transected. She has multiple tears of the mesentery. She has bleeding in all the mesenteric tissues. She has contusions and bruises of the diaphragm. So no, it's not consistent with Heimlich maneuver.
Are you familiar with the case report, pancreatic transection as a complication of the Heimlich maneuver, a case report and literature review from 2007?
I am familiar with that case report.
And have you reviewed that case report?
Yes, I have.
And in that case report, well, what did that case report essentially report out?
That was a case report of an 11-year-old child. The father felt that the child was choking. He started doing the Heimlich maneuver, and then of course he called 911. Emergency medical personnel get there. The child was transferred to the hospital. After a short time in the hospital, I don't remember if it was still that same day or in the emergency room, he complained of abdominal pain. They did CTs and found that he had a pancreas transection. That was the only injury that he had, an isolated pancreas transection. And as much as there was immediate medical attention, he survived. He got out of the hospital a few days later. He did require surgery because his pancreas was transected. Had surgery and got out of the hospital.
Now, did the study discuss whether or not there can ever be complicated, or sorry, not the study, the case report ever discussed that there could sometimes be complications due to the Heimlich maneuver?
It did. The case report discussed that it was the only case in the world of a pancreas transection related to the Heimlich maneuver. Did indicate some other papers of Heimlich maneuver injuries that have been isolated case reports. None of them resulted in the death of individuals. So
this case report is the only reported instance that you know of where the pancreas was transected. Was this the only case report that you are aware of?
It was the only case report that they were aware of, because that was in their discussion. They said this is the only known instance of a pancreas transection that we know of, and that's why they wrote the case report.
Did they make any mention about how common it is to have any kind of injuries from the Heimlich maneuver of any organ?
Yes, I mean, as in most case reports, you're going to have an introduction first. You're going to talk about. So in their introduction, they talk about the Heimlich maneuver, when it came about, how safe it is, even in the hands of inexperienced people, and that it's quite rare to have injuries. They give a little bit of a discussion about some other case reports in the literature of different injuries, and then they talk about theirs, again, as being the only known case of a pancreas transection in this 11-year-old child.
And did the case report note any other, let me just break down, did it note any bruising at all that was reported on the child?
No, sir. The case reported an isolated pancreas injury in this child.
What about fractures to the child?
No, sir.
What about the injuries to any other organ in the child's body?
There were no other organ injuries.
Did the paper also discuss the need to rule out child abuse?
Yes, it did. So the paper discussed that clearly this was something that is not commonly seen, a pancreas injury with Heimlich maneuver, and in the discussion gave the caution that, of course, in injuries like this, it's not expected at all to have this with the Heimlich maneuver, so that, of course, other alternatives for the way the child was injured would have to be evaluated and excluded.
Now, you've talked a little bit about knowing the statements that were given by Ms. Rosenbaum in this particular case, correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to us why the history that she provided would not be accounted for by this particular paper?
By this particular paper?
So the paper that we were just talking about.
Yes.
Why the history provided by Ms. Rosenbaum wouldn't account for, take into account the injury that paper talks about?
Well, because it's very dissimilar from this paper. It's dissimilar age to begin with the age. Layla was 2, this child was 11. It's very dissimilar with respect to the injuries that were noted. In the paper, the 11-year-old child had an isolated injury of the pancreas. Layla has multiple internal injuries and extensive bruises on the external body, bruises that cover most of the back. She has head trauma. Layla has old injuries, broken bones. So there are a variety of differences in the extent of injuries that are seen here. And then thirdly, and I feel most importantly, is the outcome of what happened. With the 11-year-old child, his outcome was he lived. He got to the hospital because EMTs responded, and that's one of the things with trauma. When there's a very short period of time where there's professional response to injuries, even in motor vehicle accidents, the expected outcome is that that person lives. And so, yes, that child lived, whereas we're sitting here today because I did an autopsy on a child that died from extensive trauma.
In all of your experience, have you ever seen anything like the injuries that you've seen in Layla related to any sort of resuscitative methods?
No, I have not.
Dr. Darrisaw, what caused the death of Layla Daniel?
I certified the cause of death as multiple blunt impact injuries of the torso. I think those are exact words I used. Well, in my actual cause of death, I didn't use the word multiple. In my report, blunt impact injuries of the torso, but they are multiple.
What are the different types of manner of death?
The manners of death, there are 5 different categories of manners of death that we use. We use homicide when a person's death is caused by the action. Report that the death investigator writes, but as things happen during a particular case, if we request something, that's added to it. So it's not a stagnant. So if 2 days later we call the officers and say, well, Dr. Darrisaw found this at autopsy, we need more information, that information is added to the ROM. So it becomes basically somewhat of a running document.
Now, when you did your autopsy, you did not read through the witness statements in this case, did you?
At the time of the autopsy, I had the report in the room. At the time of the autopsy, I don't believe I had the witness statements, but sometime after, we did have the transcript as well as the interview.
And where in your room did you note that?
I would not have noted that. So the ROM is generally the record that the death investigators add to. In this particular case, after just the basic information that we first received, there's an added note that defects records were received, I believe. There is a note here that comes on 11/20 that Southern Crescent Sexual Assault and Child Advocacy Center provided information as it related to the forensic interviews and the medical examinations
related to the sibling. Yeah, I don't see actually the interviews. I don't know if it wasn't added, but at some point in time, I don't remember when, it may have been sometime, it's usually after the autopsy. So the usual progression is that we don't have all of the interviews to begin with. We have the report from the coroner at the time of autopsy. Several law enforcement individuals attended the autopsy, and then as time goes on, we request and look at interviews and things of that nature.
But nowhere in your autopsy report or your report of medical examiner is it documented that you looked at the transcript of Jennifer Rosenbaum's statement, correct?
It's not documented in there, but even as of today, I have looked at those again in preparation for court today, and I'm quite familiar with those, having seen them.
Nowhere in your ROME does it state that you looked at any witness statements, correct?
It's not documented in the room, no, ma'am. It doesn't appear to
So
me.
specifically, tell me what it is that you have reviewed with regards to this case.
So I have reviewed, particularly, especially in preparation for court today, I reviewed my autopsy report. I reviewed the audio recording of the 911 call. I reviewed forensic interview that was done with the sibling, I believe her name is Millie. I reviewed interviews that law enforcement had with the sister at I believe another foster parent's house or another family's house. I reviewed the medical records from Piedmont Henry Hospital. I reviewed the transcripts of Jennifer Rosenbaum's interviews with law enforcement that were performed, I believe, the day or two after the death. So I had the videotape as well as the transcript.
And none of what you have enumerated just now is in your ROME, correct?
I don't see it in there, no.
Okay. And so when you did your autopsy, you did it with a report that came from Mr. Cleveland, the coroner, correct?
Yes.
Now, did you go out to the Rosenbaum home?
No, that would be completely outside of the realm of anything that my office does on a regular basis.
But you didn't do it, did you?
I did not know. That's not in our practice.
And you didn't read any statements of witnesses, just Jennifer Rosenbaum, correct?
That's correct. There were the interviews with the sister that I saw, and the interview with Jennifer Rosenbaum. I did see those.
Now, there are, you base your conclusions in your autopsy solely on what you see on the table, correct?
Oh, no, absolutely not. So the conclusion of making a cause of death, it's the whole post-mortem examination begins with, number one, the circumstances of the person's death. And in our office, we rely upon getting that information from the county coroner. We also may get information from law enforcement. Then an autopsy is done. And then subsequent to that, as in this case, there's then putting together things like investigative information. Often there's blood drawn to do toxicology analysis. That was done in this case. Oftentimes fluids of either maybe the eye may be taken to look at the nutritional status, such as dehydration of a person. So there's several things that are done that are not just the external and internal examination of the body. Then all of that is gathered together and a conclusion is made as to the cause of a person's death.
With regards to the documentation, we have just your word here today that you reviewed all these various sources, correct?
Yes, I guess you rely upon my word for everything I've talked about today.
And you did mention looking at photographs of the scene. You did not look at photographs of the
Yeah, I
scene.
don't recall seeing photographs of the scene, and I certainly haven't looked at those recently just for court, so I don't recall any scene photographs.
What did you see, or what were you told by the coroner about what was in the sink?
I don't recall.
You don't know, or you don't recall?
I don't recall.
Do you recall having seen a picture of chicken in the sink?
I don't recall seeing any scene photographs, and I certainly haven't seen any in recent days as I have prepared for court today.
And are you aware that there was chicken left in the drain that was reported by Jennifer Rosenbaum as being spit up by the child?
I am aware in the interviews with Jennifer Rosenbaum that she talks about small portions of food that appeared to have been in the sink, that she thought she may have seen small pieces of food.
And you're aware that despite her asking about it, it was not collected, correct?
I have no knowledge about what was collected. That's not.
You were not presented with any bolus of chicken or food substances to analyze.
No, that's correct. No, it was not.
And if it had been collected, then you yourself could have analyzed it or directed somebody else to analyze it, correct?
Not really sure what you mean by analyze. I would have seen it and
See
it
if
would have
there's-
been documented. That it's just food. There would have been no scientific test done on it for sure.
Would you not be curious as to know whether it was bile involved or whether it was amylase involved?
That's quite a strange question. There would really be no bile in a piece of food that was in the upper airway. So, or even in the bile is in the gallbladder. No, it's in the gallbladder.
Yes, but it's in the abdominal region. And
I would say that's relatively esoteric, and it's not.
so the
A piece of
answer-
chicken would not be analyzed in a scientific manner. If it was sent with the body and I was told, hey, this is what we got at the scene, or something that EMTs recovered from the airway, I would see it. In as much as we do take photographs during the time of autopsy, it would have been photographed. That's the type of thing that would have been done with something like that. It would not have been something that you send off for any testing of bile or anything of that nature.
So you would not be interested in that?
Oh, no, I wouldn't say I wouldn't be interested in it. I would do, as I said, something that came like that, it would be photographed, it would be documented that here's a piece of chicken that reportedly was in the sink or that the EMTs recovered. It's not something that would be subjected to a test.
You checked the area for obstruction, the throat area for obstruction trauma to indicate the presence of obstruction, correct?
Yes, I did look at the entirety of the airway, and there was no food in there.
And you found none at the time you looked at it, right?
That's correct.
You did not take any pictures of the interior of the throat, did you?
No, it was negative. There was nothing there.
And you knew that the defense would not be able to do a second autopsy, and that in large part anyone reviewing this case would have to rely on what you did, correct?
That's correct.
And you did not photograph or have photographed the inside of Layla's throat so that a defense expert could review your work and determine whether there was evidence of a previous obstruction.
So, as we previously talked about...
If you could answer my question yes or no, and then you can explain.
I can't really answer yes or no. I'm going to explain the answer of what I did.
Let me repeat the question.
Sure.
You did not photograph or have photographed the inside of Layla's throat so that a defense expert could review your work.
No photographs were taken of the airway, no. The documentation of what was found in the airway is documented in my autopsy report, which documents numerous things that have not been photographed.
And trauma to the throat isn't always present after someone has been choking, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And your findings are that Layla did not die from choking, but you do say that she may have appeared to have been choking.
The death process of this child with the extensive abdominal trauma that she had would present itself as someone going into shock as she did. Her arms are flailing. She has this appearance of having a seizure. She is not breathing very well. Her brain is not getting oxygen, and it has this choking type appearance. Yes, that's quite understandable, yes.
And so a lay person might very well think that choking is going on.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And you wrote a lot about bruising. You talked a lot about bruising.
Yes, we
today.
did talk a lot about bruising.
Coloration of a bruise does not scientifically reflect the timing of the bruise, isn't that correct?
Well, that's correct. I think I mentioned that earlier.
But you discussed with Mr. Chase all sorts of timing based on the coloration of the bruise.
No, I discussed with Mr. Chase a lot of information about the timing of the bruise based upon the microscopic examination. I talked about in general that, everyone in the courtroom can kind of differentiate old versus new, and that's about it. But then I talked about that as a pathologist, I have a couple of other options for me to talk about timing. One of those options is to be able to cut into the skin and then look at it on the microscope. So all of the timing that we discussed was based upon my microscopic evaluation.
So you would agree with me then that the color of a bruise does not necessarily indicate the time?
Yes, I've previously testified to that.
Okay.
Basically, the color allows one to just differentiate old versus new, and beyond that, in terms of, well, is it 2 hours, 5 hours? Nothing really does that. But the microscopics give you an idea of, did it just occur 15 minutes ago, or was it about an hour or more?
Now, but you cannot look at a bruise and determine its age, correct?
Yes, that's very well my point of view. You can differentiate old versus new. You can't just look at it. We have the ability to only look at the outside. The pathologist has more abilities to look at things on the inside.
What is the endotracheal tube that is in the mouth was placed during the time that the EMS were working on the child, correct?
That's correct, and it was still in place at the time of autopsy, as you saw in the photographs.
And that endotracheal tube could have caused the injuries to the lips, could it not?
That's possible, yes. Those are type of things I've seen. It's not uncommon for us to see red marks on the lips with the endotracheal tube placement. That would be in the realm of something that's logically consistent with CPR trauma.
What is a post-mortem artifact?
A post-mortem artifact is something, it's basically an artifact. Things such as, let's say for instance, we saw on the body the EKG patches. So with EKG patches, you may see little red marks under there. That would be an artifact of a CPR patch. Another artifact may be the drying that you see once the body has died. If there's an old injury, it gets really dry. That's a postmortem artifact.
Well, let's talk about the hypopigmented mark in the middle of the abdomen.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that much with Mr. Chase, but yeah, she had this mark on her lower abdomen.
And that could be a post-mortem artifact, could it not?
You would have shown me a picture, not the scar. Are you referring to the scar that she has? That is not postmortem artifact. She has a scar.
So you're saying that's a scar, the
Yeah.
white.
If we're talking about the same, can I see a picture that you're referring to? But she has a scar that's clearly an old scar, and it's not a postmortem artifact at all.
Let me show you while I'm looking for this. Exhibit 348. That bruising on the palm of the hand on this area, that is not bruising from abuse, is it?
That is not something that I think I've talked about in my autopsy report. I may have called it a color. This is something that I see, this little blue, purple, dark color just at the base of the palm of the thumb in many instances of autopsies. I don't consider it a bruise. I call it just a color. If you don't cut into it to see that it's a bruise, then you won't know. I typically don't cut into these because I'm quite familiar and comfortable with seeing that color and thinking that it's nothing. So for me, I'm comfortable with seeing that color. Given a certain history, like I had a recent case with a history of a child that had been abused actually and had several impacts to the hand, She had the dark color, but a lot more significant than what I typically see. I did cut into her hand, and it was bruising. But I'm quite comfortable with seeing that color, and I don't even cut into the hands. So, no, this is not something that I described in my report as any injury.
Similarly, page number 37, the bruise on the hand here is not really a bruise, is
And
it?
actually, can I just stop for a minute? Because I'm not sure that I'm looking at the actual autopsy photos. The autopsy photos have our number and placard in it, and
I'm not showing you the autopsy
okay,
photos.
because
I'm
I
showing
probably
you-
prefer to testify the pictures that we took.
I understand, but you are subject to also discussing other pictures in a court of law. So this area of blue mark, that is not a bruise, is it?
I didn't see a bruise in that area in my autopsy.
Now let's talk about this white area right here. What is it a scar from?
I don't know.
How do you know it's a scar?
I think everyone in this courtroom can identify scars. So for me, I know it's a scar not only as a layperson, but I also know as a scar as a doctor because, well, it is a scar. It's not the normal. A scar is a previous injury, and so it affects the actual skin itself. It's not as pliable as the normal skin. It typically has this white, sometimes a gray color. Once an injury has occurred, it becomes scarred. And I recognize scars. I think a lot of us recognize scars, and that's how I recognize it as a scar.
So you believe it's a scar?
I recognize it as a scar, yes, I do.
And did you do the shaving of the head?
Yes, I previously indicated that I shaved the head.
And you did not make mention of some of the cuts on the scalp. Were those made by a scalpel as you were shaving?
There were not many cuts on the scalp. She had abrasions that were, many of them in various stages of healing that were not done at the time of autopsy. And she had several bruises that were clearly not from having the hair shaved.
So you're saying none of the cuts on the head were from...
Well, sometimes you could see maybe a little nick that had no blood coloring in it because as the person is dead, there's no blood flow. And as you're shaving, you may see a little nick, flesh colored. None of that was evident in the pictures that we actually showed today because we showed the actual injuries on the child.
But your answer is yes, you did make nicks as a result of shaving,
There may
correct?
be one or two nicks that were on the scalp.
Now, the reason to mention them is so as to avoid confusion by police, DAs, defense attorneys, correct? You don't mention these in your report, do you?
Well, no, my report documents the injuries that were found at autopsy, and the injuries were quite evident versus a post-mortem nick of a very superficial part of the scalp.
If this child is known to bounce up and down on a bunk bed, hitting her head on the bunk above her, could she have had some of those injuries occur as a result of repetitive banging her head against the top of a bunk?
Yes, I think I've alluded to that already. She can certainly have some of those isolated, but looking at the photograph that we saw, she has bruises on the sides, the back, the top, the front. That's certainly not a repetition of just hitting one part of the head. The extent of the bruises on her scalp are right, left, very deep into the actual muscle, the temporalis muscle we talked about. Some of them, that answer is yes, but all of them, no.
Can we have the lights, please? Seconds. I noticed the septum was intact. Is that correct?
What septum?
Septum of the nose.
Yes.
She did not break her nose, did she? The nose was not broken.
No, I didn't find that the nose was broken, no.
Can we have the lights turned on?
Oh, you want them to turn on?
No, turned on, yes.
Okay.
I can't see.
You want them all? Put it up.
Thank you. Now, in your initial review of the body, you palpitated the body, correct?
Yeah, well, I touched the body, yes.
But didn't you say in your report that you palpitated the body?
Palpated, which you would have to.
Palpated the limbs.
Can you show me what you're referring to?
I'll show you your... And see if this refreshes your recollection.
Yeah, this is my report. Are you talking about one particular page or area? Can
No, I'm asking you if you palpated the arms or the legs when you did your examination.
I touched them, yes, and I'm able to move them.
And didn't you say that you were not able to see or feel any fractures?
I did say that. I said that the extremities were free of palpable or visible fractures. So we saw the picture of her when I saw her. Just looking at her on the outside, no, I didn't recognize that her arms looked of different size. And so, no, I wasn't able to recognize the fractures from the outside. I did x-rays and then I took the bones out.
And you said you didn't see any palpable fractures.
Well, that means that when I touched the bones, they weren't like because they weren't fresh fractures, they were healing. So in that respect, I wouldn't be able to bend and find like a fresh fracture. That's what that means.
I understand that's what you're saying it means. Now, I'm asking you, did you say that there was no palpable fracture?
Yes, yeah, there were no palpable fractures. There were no fresh fractures whereby that I would be able to move the bone because they were already healing.
Now, the one to the 8th rib was old, was it not?
Yes.
And are you able to put a date on it?
Probably a couple weeks.
You also said that in a couple weeks, the tibia would have healed.
No, I
correct?
said a month, a couple of months. Yeah.
A couple months, the
Yeah.
tibia would have healed.
Yes.
Are you aware that the cast was taken off of the child prior to the child dying?
Yes. Yeah, the casts are taken off before a bone is completely healed. Once it's set and a cast is taken off, there are still healing processes that at a time of autopsy, a pathologist will see what it looks like. When I mean by heal, it means as a pathologist that it looks completely normal now. The bone is completely healed. A cast is going to come off well before a pathologist still sees healing features when a cast is taken off.
While there was no commensurate bruising on the outside of the child, there was damage in the inside of the chest area, was there not?
Yes, there was.
So there was bruising on the inside of the chest walls, correct?
There was, as we talked about, when you see on the inside, yes, she had the number of bruises on the shoulder area. We looked at those. Yes, you see that as the skin is reflected, just as we saw in the actual picture of the arm when the skin was reflected.
So it's fair to say that some extreme pressure was put on the chest cavity, some blunt force trauma, correct?
Yes, she had some blunt force trauma to the chest. It was reflected by bruises on the outside and injuries to the inside.
Did you see bruises on her chest?
Yeah, there's a photograph of the bruising in the, I believe it's the left upper chest area on the shoulder.
That's on the neck area. I'm talking about the chest.
Well, I'm talking about the chest as well. The chest involves everything from just under the neck all the way. So in the upper chest area, there was bruising. In the middle of the chest, no, there wasn't.
Between the nipples, there was no bruising, was there?
Well, the chest is more than between the nipples.
Forgive me then, but between the nipples, there was no bruising,
Oh,
was
correct.
there?
If you're talking about the center of the chest. In the center of the chest, between the nipples, no, there were no bruises.
But there was bleeding on the inside.
There was a small amount of the little bleeding that we saw around the heart, and then there was some bleeding into the thymus that we talked about.
And it could have been a punch, or it could have been a thrust that caused that. Is that not correct?
Blunt impact trauma, yes, would be inclusive of both of those mechanisms.
A punch, a thrust, or any other mechanism that brings great force upon the chest, correct?
Correct.
There was no bruising on the outside of the abdominal area, was there?
Yes, there was. There was a significant amount of bruises that we saw in the photograph, mostly of the lower abdomen, not much in the upper abdomen.
Okay, let's talk about the upper abdomen.
Sure.
Is there any bruising in the upper abdomen?
Not many bruises in the upper abdomen.
No indication that a shoe or foot had landed on the child's stomach, is there?
There was no external pattern injury of a foot or shoe.
And in fact, there were no patterned injuries at all in this case, were there?
I didn't particularly recognize any pattern injuries. Now, some of the injuries, and we saw photographs, have this irregular shape, but in terms of being able to look at, when I talk about a pattern injury, it means that I can look at something and I can see that's an iron, for instance, or that's a belt. I can see the pattern. Although some of these injuries have somewhat of an irregular, I call it geographic shape, I didn't see anything that I could recognize as a belt, a shoe, a particular pattern. So in that respect, those are considered non-specific bruises.
Now, there are no recent rib fractures found, were there?
That's correct.
And that does not eliminate Layla having undergone intensive CPR.
Oh, that's correct.
And CPR-related rib fractures on toddlers are rare, aren't they?
Quite rare, yes.
And the absence of rib fractures cannot then be used to imply that very aggressive CPR was not performed.
You may have to ask that question again. It got a little bit confusing.
The absence of rib fractures does not imply that aggressive CPR was not used.
Oh, that's correct. It's most often that you don't see rib fractures in children with CPR.
In fact, the first responder saw Jennifer doing CPR and they took over until they got to the hospital, didn't they?
I believe that's what I recall from the history.
Since the fact that CPR-related rib fractures in this age of a child are rare, the presence of that old rib fracture is suggestive of perhaps an old child abuse injury, correct?
Yes, it is.
And it could have well predated the time the Rosenbaums had the child.
When did they have the child?
I'm asking the questions here.
I'm sorry.
Objection, Your Honor. I don't see how she can provide an answer unless the defense counsel gives some more context.
Agreed.
Would it predate the time that the Rosenbaums had the children if the Rosenbaums had the children from July 14th onwards?
Oh, no, that's completely inconsistent. A rib fracture, that old rib fracture, that would be a time frame of 4 months? Yeah, no, it would not predate that.
Okay, so your testimony is it's not as much as 4 months old.
Oh, absolutely.
And let's talk about the stomach having 35 cc's of orange tan food. That would be consistent with Layla having had carrots and chicken to eat, wouldn't it?
I didn't see any food particles that were recognizable. So all I see is like just soft material that has a color of orange tan, but there's no recognizable food particles, so I can't make any assessment of what that may be.
Now, her spleen was intact.
That's correct.
Her reproductive system was intact.
Yes, the uterus and ovaries had no injuries.
There was no brain damage or hemorrhage.
That's correct.
And the pancreas and the liver, in order to transect or tear these organs, a great deal of force has to be placed on the child's abdomen, correct?
Correct.
And what essentially happens is a wedging of the organs against the spine. Isn't that correct?
Well, at least with pancreas, the liver doesn't require this particular mechanism as the pancreas does. The liver is injured in more can be liver injured in several ways, with broad impacts or directed. So a liver injury is not as specific as the pancreas.
But the pancreas is basically the blunt force trauma pushes it up against the spine, and there's nowhere for the organ to go, and so it splits, correct?
That's correct.
But that's what you call blunt force trauma, right?
That's what everyone calls blunt force trauma.
Well,
That
I'm
is
asking
that
if
is a
it's you.
definition. Yeah, that's the definition of blunt force trauma. The definition of blunt force trauma is impacts to an area that causes an injury that may be a laceration or bruise. That is a definition of blunt force trauma.
And that is also what happens if you were to take a child and thrust upwards very strongly, correct?
A thrust is in the category of a mechanism of blunt force. That's correct.
Any type of intensive force applied to the abdomen could cause the pancreas to split.
In that directed, very specific area, yes.
And you can't exclude the possibility that deep thrusting into the abdominal area during the administration of Heimlich could have ruptured the pancreas.
I can't exclude it because we've seen that at least one time in the world there's a case reported.
So you cannot exclude it, can you?
That's correct.
The bruises on Layla's back could similarly be the result of intense pounding on the back during the time someone tried to dislodge the chicken, correct?
The bruises on the back that include the entirety of the back are certainly bruises from pounding on the back. With respect to the question of whether that would be consistent with pounding on the back with chicken being a foreign object, it's certainly not a logical and reasonable ideal for me to accept because of how extensive it is. It extends from the neck to the butt. So for me, no, that's not consistent to me with pounding on the back from chicken.
And isn't it true, though, that you can't exclude that in the chaos of it all, in the panic of it all, that somebody who's administering Heimlich or CPR in a inappropriate way could cause damage to the child's back in that way? You can't exclude that, can you?
Well, there's a couple of things that are very problematic with me that I would say I excluded for a number of reasons. So I excluded for a number of reasons. I excluded A, for what I've already previously mentioned. There's extensive bruising that covers the entirety of the back. I excluded for a second reason because in a scenario of CPR, the scenario of CPR would be done for a reason, for someone that is near death or dying or really having significant distress whereby the heart is not beating normally. It's CPR. CPR is resuscitation for someone that's dying. So the extent of the significant bruising is of a child who has a very vibrant heartbeat already. So those are the reasons I excluded.
So you're saying basically that with Layla on her back and aggressive CPR being performed and pushing into the stomach and chest would not cause rupture of the pancreas?
That's correct.
Now the bruises on the side, the purple ones that we've seen.
You've seen some bruises along her hip, yes.
Yes. Those. The bruises on her hip that we saw earlier, could they have been inflicted by somebody holding the child by the hip and digging their fingers in while pressing the child up against the sink?
The bruising that we saw earlier, at least in the photographs that were taken at autopsy, are not consistent with that. They're much more confluent or large area bruising as opposed to being what we talk about as fingertip bruising. When we see fingertip bruising, we see small circular bruises. Here there was, at least on one of the photographs, you saw the bruise that had the abrasion over it. There's no reasonable mechanism to think of fingertips causing an abrasion. So the bruises, one of which had overlying abrasion, is not consistent with fingertips and holding an individual, and particularly an individual that may be choking and dying. Again, the whole idea of how much force and how much blood pressure is present when a person is dying and requires CPR.
If a lay person determines that CPR is needed on their own, that doesn't necessarily mean that's true, is it?
That's correct.
Thank you. An autopsy is only part of a death investigation, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And a death investigation includes a thorough evaluation of all the reported circumstances, a review of the child's medical history, correct?
That's correct.
And this was not done in your report, was it?
Yes, it was.
You examined the child's medical history in your report? You didn't discuss it, did you?
Well, the autopsy report is not going to discuss all that. Autopsy report is just going to be the discussion of the autopsy, the external examination, the internal examination. It's a standalone document. Everything that's done in the investigation is what allows me to come to a conclusion, but my autopsy report doesn't provide all that information.
The autopsy is not a black box that just spits out the response, is it?
Correct.
You have to consider the other elements of the death investigation, correct?
Yes, and that was done in this case.
And there are some injuries which speak from themselves in that the specific injury could only have been caused by a very specific mechanism, correct?
Can you ask that again?
There are some injuries that speak for themselves because the specific injury could only have been caused by a very specific mechanism.
That's a confusing question to me. I don't know if I know how to answer that.
Okay, well, I don't want to confuse you. Many injuries, such as the one on Layla, are not specific and could be caused by different mechanisms. Isn't that true?
Yes, the Leila has numerous injuries. They are all in the category of blunt impact injuries. That would be inclusive of the fractures as well. Those are blunt impact injuries. And there can be different ways that blunt impact injuries can come about. With the blunt impact injuries to the abdomen, it could be someone standing still and being punched. It can be someone laying on their back and being stomped. So in that respect, there may not be something specific that one would say, but you know that there's great force that's applied to the areas where we see the injuries. There's pounding on the back, there's extensive trauma to the abdomen, there's impacts to the head. All of the places that we see the injuries, those are areas that were impacted. There's not a specific thing that you can say, but we know that there are various different ways that could have come about with the back, the abdomen, or the head.
One of those ways is through thrusting done. Improper Heimlich thrusts into the abdominal area. Isn't that one of the ways?
Well, I think I've already answered that question, that a thrusting mechanism can cause injury to the abdomen. Whether a Heimlich maneuver can cause the liver to be lacerated, all of the mesenteric tissues to be torn, to have all the extensive hemorrhage associated with it from a child that's near dying, that is a completely improbable, illogical thing for me to accept as why Layla has the injuries that she has.
The people who wrote the case note you refer to also thought it was very improbable when they first ran into that situation, didn't they?
The people that wrote the case report, yes, but the people that wrote the case report also were able to accept that because of the fact that it was only an isolated injury, the child recovered and was alive. So, and I in fact am able to accept that child's isolated pancreas injury as from a Heimlich maneuver even after reviewing it. So I can accept that. Layla's injuries I do not accept as being caused by a thrust from the Heimlich maneuver.
You only report what you see, correct?
I report what I evaluate. So as a medical forensic pathologist, my task and my role is to make observations. So I make the observations of autopsy findings. Then I document those in a detailed manner, which I did in my report. And then my third obligation is to interpret those in a logical and reasonable fashion along with everything else that's related to the death investigation. And in this case, in my reasonable and logical analysis of everything, I came to the conclusion that Layla's injuries were not the result of either Heimlich maneuver, inexperienced Heimlich maneuver, or chaos that would have been related to CPR. That is something I have not accepted as a reasonable conclusion in this case.
And do you accept the fact that reasonable minds can differ?
Yes, I do accept that.
And finally, you don't know who caused the death of this child, do you?
That's correct. I do not know that.
You're right.
Give me a second, Dr. Darrisaw. Dr. Darrisaw, I want to show you what's been admitted as Defendant's Exhibit 136. What was the date of the autopsy again?
I performed the autopsy on Friday, November 20th, 2015.
What is the last entry on this report of the medical record that Ms. Mull referred to?
The last entry there is 11/21/2015.
So that was the next day?
Yes.
Is it safe to say that a lot more work was done on this particular case after the day after the autopsy?
Yes. I mean, there's in fact, as I said, this is a running document. Even to date, there's additional things. You and I had a pre-trial meeting. That's something that I would have in the record of the medical examiner. So I put in there on such and such a day, Mr. Eddie Chase and I met for a pre-trial meeting and discussed the autopsy reports. And then I put my name and I put my date there. So that's always a running document throughout the entirety of just that case. So this may predate maybe the latest entry, but...
Well, that was my next question. Do we know when this particular report was actually printed?
Yes, I don't know when that was printed. If the Rome was printed today, it would have the two entries that I put in there. We, prosecution attorneys, and I met for a pretrial meeting, and so that Rome would have those two entries.
I want to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 399. Do you recognize State's 399?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
This is the autopsy report. This is my autopsy report, in fact, of this particular case, Layla's autopsy.
And was this the complete report that you finalized?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, I'd move to admit State's 399. Dr. Darrisaw, I'm sorry. Thank you, Judge. Dr. Darrisaw, what was the date on this report? I didn't zoom in, if not.
The report date is 6/29/2016.
And why does it take you so long to issue a report after the actual autopsy?
Well, after the actual autopsy, we've already talked about various things that were done and things were looked at under the microscope. So those microscopic sections come back. After the report, there's investigative information comes and goes, and so the autopsy report has to, it has all of that information. I come to an opinion, and my opinion reflects the fact that my judgment of the cause and manner of death are based upon everything that I've seen. So it typically will take, just to give you an idea, that our autopsy reports are expected to be done within 90 days of doing the autopsy. And that would be just general, what we consider non-complex cases. Most cases like this, when a child has a lot of injuries or maybe very extensive gunshot wounds, someone's been shot 50 times, that is in like the complex range. Or if you have to do a lot of other testing, that would be complex. So then those reports are going to be more than 90 days. But autopsy reports are generally out within 90 days, and it's typically longer with complex cases.
Dr. Darrisaw, Ms. Moll asked you about several statements that were given by the defendant. Did you also have an opportunity to review the statement that Ms. Rosenbaum gave to the defects worker the night of the death?
Yes, and I don't have an independent recollection of 2015, whether I had that then, but of course, to date, in preparation for the trial, I did review that.
Okay. And do you recall if you need to refresh your recollection, that's fine, just let me know, but do you recall if Ms. Rosenbaum indicated anything whatsoever about any food coming out?
I think I did recall her talking about small little pieces, not whole pieces of chicken, but
Do you recall
if you
that?
have the report, I can look at it.
Sure. Would it help to refresh your recollection?
Yeah, this talks about various things. She put a knife, butter knife down her throat. Nothing ever came out. Yeah, I don't see that that's reflected in this narrative.
So the information that she provided to DFACS that night did not mention anything about any pieces of chicken coming out, correct?
It doesn't look like that's reflected in that narrative.
And was DFACS present for the actual, was DFACS present for the autopsy?
Well, there were several people that worked for defects present at the autopsy, yes.
Ms. Moll also asked you about whether or not a lay person might think that they were observing choking, correct?
That's correct.
However, would that also presuppose that the trauma occurred first? When would if a lay person were to observe Layla, if they thought they were observing choking, when would the trauma have occurred?
The question is a little bit confusing, but to reiterate my testimony.
Sure.
My testimony is that based upon my autopsy findings, the significant injuries that she has, and looking at the fact that some of the injuries already have the body trying to respond to them, that Layla sustained trauma, very significant trauma that the body is trying to react to now. At the time that she had the trauma, her heart was beating normally and vigorously like a child's heart would beat, and that's why there's so much blood in the abdomen. And at that point in time, sometime later, about an hour or so, maybe a little less or more, then her body is going into shock. She's starting to die because she has trauma. That was her cause of death. And then to a person that sees her, her arms are shaking, her legs are shaking, her eyes are moving in the back of her head. She may appear to be choking because she's not breathing well, because she is dying because she has trauma. And at that point, yes, then she would need CPR.
But the trauma occurs first?
That's correct.
Ms. Moll asked you about post-mortem artifact and whether or not that could explain the hypopigmented area on the abdomen, correct?
It's correct. That's not a post-mortem artifact. That's a scar that she has.
Okay. Now, in photographs that were taken at the would you expect to see any postmortem artifact 90 minutes after death?
You can,
Okay.
yes.
But is that, but in your opinion, that is not postmortem artifact?
No, that is a clear, recognizable hypopigmented or depigmentation of her skin. That is a scar that she has, and it's an old thing. I have scars, and they're just depigmented areas that I've had from a child, so no one can actually say how old they are or how they occurred, but it's an old scar that expands across the lower abdomen. How it occurred, I don't know. It's not post-mortem, it's a scar.
Let me ask you this, hypothetically speaking, if a person saw that same area of the body a month before and they saw it was a red area, how would that impact your opinion at all?
Well, at that point in time, that would mean that when it was red, that it was probably seen fresher in its fresh state. And then as it then becomes a scar, it's white and it's older. So if someone saw that broad area on her lower abdomen and is red, it means that it had occurred sooner than when I saw it, when it was just an old scar at that point in time.
Dr. Darrisaw, in states 411, if we could light just for a second. Is anything that we are looking at here nicks from shaving Layla's head?
No, sir.
How about in states 412?
I don't see any. If I can see the actual picture, a small little nick that may be made at the time of autopsy probably wouldn't even project very well on the screen. No, I don't see any. It's quite common that you're very careful in shaving the scalp, especially when there are injuries. Like I say, maybe one or two or three things, maybe a very superficial lifting of the skin, but it's certainly not causing red abrasions with healing and bruises. That's not something that comes from shaving the scalp.
How about states 413? You seeing any of these nicks that you're talking about?
I see your picture up, just...
Sure.
No, I don't see any. It looks like this shaves quite well without any nicks.
Dr. Darrisaw, the defense also asked you about not seeing any shoe or foot imprints, correct?
That's correct.
In abdominal trauma cases, is that unusual if it was inflicted on the front side?
No, and I think I've testified to that before. One can have actually a very significant impact to the abdomen with a steering wheel. If it doesn't impact the chest, and if it's just in the abdomen, that's just going to compress all that skin, it's going to injure all of the internal organs, but very commonly you won't see anything on the outside. So you can talk about a shoe, a bat, a steering wheel in the very compressible skin of the abdomen and not see anything on the outside. So the inside reflects the injuries.
The lights can come up. You also discussed it's rare to see rib fractures in children. Can you tell us a little bit more about how children's ribs are at Layla's age?
Well, the ribs in children, they can be bent, and you can press on them, and that's why when you have an actual rib fracture, the mechanism is a very forceful squeezing. Typically in that forceful squeezing, the rib cage is a rounded cage, and in that forceful squeezing you tend to see the fractures along the side. So if you kind of envision me squeezing ribs here, the fracture would be along the side as I squeeze it together. Or also you may see it just along the back where you're squeezing in. And it requires significant force because the bone is a lot more pliable in the child at this point in time, at 2 years of age.
You also discussed with Ms. Mull that the unlikelihood that once Layla was in distress, that she would continue to bruise, correct? Once she was in cardiac distress.
Once she was actually in distress and not, we've already talked about once a person dies, well, the heart is not beating at all. But when someone is going into shock and they require CPR, their heart may be still beating faintly, and then as you do CPR, you're getting a little bit of blood pressure, so you may have blood vessels breaking and a small amount of bleeding around it, like in the picture of her heart on the surface. That's really consistent with something that you may see with a CPR injury. The heart is not beating very well. There's a small amount of bleeding around it.
If, assuming Layla was in stress, okay, would you expect, in showing the State's Exhibit 1, would you expect to see that amount of bruising?
Again, just for the purpose of me making note of the fact that this is not an autopsy photograph, kind of like to talk about my pictures that I directed. But yeah, these are a lot of bruises on the back, and this appears to be a picture taken obviously before she came to autopsy. So there's extensive amount of bruising that you see right now. Bruises really don't develop immediately after they're sustained.
And I'm sorry, Dr. Darrisaw, I couldn't locate it before, but now I have. So now this is one of your photos, correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. If I can have one moment, Your Honor.
Nothing further.
Did you notice any hair having been pulled out of the head?
I didn't notice any patches of hair loss that would be consistent with hair being pulled out of the head. No, ma'am.
Thank you.
Nothing else? All right, thank you, doctor. You can step down.
Thank you.
And can she be excused?
Yes, Judge.
Okay, you're excused.
Thank you, sir.
All right, do we have another short witness? Where are we at this point?
And Judge, at this time, the state of court rests.
Okay, the state rests. Counsel approach. We're going to go ahead and excuse you for the rest of the day. There are some things we need to do outside of your presence. We'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you again for your time and your patience. Is everybody? Okay. Ms. Moore, you have a motion?
Yes, no, we move for directed verdict on all counts. We don't believe there's been sufficient evidence to show that any of the counts were applicable to Joseph Rosenbaum. There's been absolutely no evidence that he was involved in any way in any of the counts that enumerated that are account for him. And with regards to Jennifer Rosenbaum, we similarly move for directed verdict on the grounds that there's not sufficient evidence to point to her as being the person who committed any acts of violence against Layla.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I think the easiest way to address this is to group some of the counts together. So I'll be talking about counts 1, malice murder, count 2, felony murder, count 3, aggravated assault, count 4, felony murder, count 5, cruelty in the first, count 6, felony murder, count 7, aggravated battery at the same time. They all involve the death of Laila Daniel on November 17 of 2015. First of all, the date of the incident was testified to by numerous people. The date of death by Dr. Evans, he called the time of death. Dr. Darrisaw just testified that the cause of the death was blunt force injury to the abdomen, pancreas, liver, and small intestine. That was gone through in detail as to each of those items. So I believe there's sufficient evidence as to those counts. It was also indicated that the only two people in the home at the time were Jennifer Rosenbaum and Millie Place. Millie was upstairs. The injuries occurred within an hour of the symptoms being visible to the individuals in the home, which puts the only two people in the home as being Jennifer and Millie.
All right, that's counts 1 through
That's counts 1 through 7.
7. Would you like to make a response to 1 through 7?
No, 1 through 7, my response would be that there is insufficient evidence. I think, as came out of the state's presentation, that Joseph was no evidence that he was at the house at the time within an hour of the time this occurred. So, with regards to second-degree murders, there is no evidence of that.
Second degree is count number 8.
Yes, I haven't addressed that yet.
All right, so as it relates to counts 1 through 7, the motion for directed verdict is denied.
Your Honor, as to the next I will discuss is counts 8 and count 9, murder in the second degree and the underlying cruelty in the second degree. Those apply to Joseph Rosenbaum. As noted earlier, the cause of injury in this case was blunt force trauma to the abdomen, pancreas, liver, and intestine. The key factor in these two counts is that the defendant was negligent in leaving the children in Jennifer Rosenbaum's care, knowing that she had previously abused them, specifically in this case, Layla. We get that information, and that evidence comes from, first of all, Millie's testimony. She indicated that when Jennifer would spank her and Layla with a belt on their skin, it occurred in the bedroom. The defendant was present. Defendant Joseph was present in the room. I asked her, what was he doing? She stated nothing. I then asked her, was he awake? And she said, I asked her actually, was he asleep? She said, no, he was awake. So we clearly had knowledge that this abuse was going on. As well, in Millie's interview, she indicated that when they had bruises, the defendant, being defendant Joseph Rosenbaum, would put some cream on her bruises, and that cream was smelled like old people and was icy and hot, and that he put it on the bruises, not Jennifer Rosenbaum. Again, him being aware of the injuries to the children. This was also corroborated by a picture from CSI where we saw that there was that icy hot cream in the defendant's bedroom. We also know that on the specific date of the incident, the defendant was caring for the children. He was responsible for the children up until Jennifer Rosenbaum came home. There was evidence that he had taken Layla to the bathroom at one point. She was not potty trained. She was still in diapers and pull-ups, which means that he had to have been assisting Layla in using the bathroom. And there's no way that no one would have not seen those injuries that were on Layla's body at that time if they viewed any part of her back or front. There was also indication that from Millie, when she spoke to her therapist, Ann McCullough, that she heard Jennifer and Joseph to kill Layla, and this was done during an argument, whereas Joseph making the comment to kill Layla, it can be inferred that there was an argument that if they were arguing about the abuse that Jennifer was inflicting on the children, and Joseph was warning her that she was going to kill Layla if he continued doing so. So I believe there's sufficient evidence to show that he was aware of the injuries, and he didn't do anything to protect the children. He was a caregiver. He was responsible for these children. He was the foster father. He took part in caring for them, bathing them, changing them. He knew what had to have seen their bodies. These were young children who need help in the bath, need help going potty, and he essentially turned a blind eye. So I believe there's sufficient evidence to go to the jury on counts 8 and 9.
Response?
With regards to those counts, there is no evidence that he knew the bruises were inflicted in any way by Jennifer Rosenbaum. There is no evidence of that. Simply putting cream on bruises is probably the natural thing to do. You see bruises on a child, you assume bruises occurred as a result of play. You don't know anything different. With regards to Millie's statement that he stood by while she administered spankings with a belt, first of all, we would contest the veracity of that, but this is not the place to do it. But assuming that what she says is correct, that does not, this is corporal punishment, which is permissible in Georgia. They have not been able to tie any of the extensive bruising to Joseph. They have never been able to say that he saw any of the extensive bruising. And for that reason, Your Honor, I think one of the main, to show neglect, to show that he knew, and there's absolutely no evidence that he knew of anything.
The motion for directed verdict as to counts 8 and counts 9 are denied.
Your Honor, as to counts 10 and 11, those are the injuries, the blunt force to Layla's head done by Jennifer on November 17 of 2015. Dr. Darrisaw just testified that those were acute and that they occurred on the day of the death. And therefore, they were in relative to the time where the other injuries occurred. So I believe there's sufficient evidence to go to the jury on those 2 counts as well.
Any response?
We stand on our motion.
Motion is denied as to those counts.
Your Honor, to counts 12 and 13, again, aggravated assault and cruelty to children. This is both Jennifer and Joseph charged on November 15, 2015 with blunt force to the child's head. Dr. Darrisaw testified that those abrasions on her head were starting to scar. They were white, had white edges, and that they were a few days old. Therefore, they fit the time period, were different, happened at a different time than those that occurred on November 17 of 2015. By all accounts, even Jennifer Rosenbaum's statement, the only 2 people that were caring for this children in the 2 weeks prior to Layla's death were Jennifer and Joseph. Therefore, I believe there's sufficient evidence to go to the jury on counts 12 and 13.
Any responses to 12 and 13?
Stand on our motion.
All right, it's denied as to 12 and 13.
As to counts 14 and 15, aggravated assault and cruelty to children in the first degree. Both defendants are named in these two counts. It's blunt force to the child's head. This information comes from numerous witnesses who testified that they saw bruises to the children, that they saw specifically that they were, one injury I believe happened at, someone observed an injury at Noah's Ark on October 17 of 2015. Another, I believe one of the gym tech individuals said they saw injuries on November 2nd of 2015. This is also Dr. Darrisaw did indicate that the injuries to Layla's head, there was actually 3 different time periods, 3 different time ranges that happened on 3 distinctive dates. So we know that we've got November 17 as being acute, November 15 would be subacute, and then as to counts 14 and 15, those would be older than the previous injuries. There is a date range, but I'd also like to point out as to counts 14 and 15 that we are asking for the charge that the dates are immaterial. We did narrow them down as best we could, but we can't pinpoint the exact date as to the older injuries to the head.
Response?
Judge, you just stand on our motion. Just would note that testimony was the injuries could have been weeks old, and that necessarily does not place them in the care of Jennifer and Joseph Rosenbaum.
All right. The motion is denied as to 14 and 15.
Your Honor, I'll address counts 16, 17, 18, and 19 at the same time. 16 is aggravated assault. Defendant is Jennifer on November 17 of 2015. That's blunt force to the child's back. Count 17, cruelty in the first degree. Defendant Jennifer, November 17, blunt force to the child's back. Count 18, aggravated assault, Jennifer and Joseph, November 15, blunt force to the child's back. And 19, cruelty in the first. Jennifer and Joseph are named in that count, November 15 of 2015. All 4 counts involve the injuries to the child's back. As Dr. Darrisaw testified, some of those injuries from the back were fresh injuries within, I believe, like an hour or so before the child died. And there was also some healing injuries. There was a lot of discussion about the different colors and the redness to the back, as well as the more different colored ones closer to the neck, and how those injuries did not occur on that same date. So I believe as to count 16, 17, 18, and 19, there's sufficient evidence to go to the jury.
Any response?
Your Honor, we stand on our motion.
Motion is denied as to 16, 17, 18, and 19.
The next 4 charges are counts 20, 21, 22, and 23. They all involve blunt force to Layla's chest, abdomen, hip, and torso. Count 20 is aggravated assault, charged Jennifer, November 17, 2015. Count 21 is cruelty to children in the first degree, charges Jennifer, November 17, 2015. Count 2, aggravated assault, charges both defendants. That occurred November 15 of 2015. And count 23, cruelty in the first, charges both Jennifer and Joseph on November 15 of 2015. Again, Dr. Darrisaw talked about the injuries being new, acute, having occurred on November 17, 2015, specifically with some injuries in the chest and the abdomen, the liver laceration, and she also indicated that there was an older liver injury. It was healing. She also said there was a lot of iron in it, so she knew it was a few days to a week old. She also talked about the abdomen and the small intestine, and the bruising of the diaphragm. So there is evidence as to old and new injuries either being on the date of Layla's death or being a few days prior. We've also charged it as torso, chest, abdomen, and hip, and means or, so if the jurors find either one of those, it would be sufficient to convict on those counts. So I believe there is sufficient evidence as to counts 20, 21, 22, and 23 to go to the jury.
Any response? Motion is denied as to 20, 21, 22, and 23.
Next is counts 24 and 25. This has to do with the blunt force to the pubic and vaginal area of Layla. Count 24, 25, 26, and 27. That all has to do with bruising to the vaginal and pubic area of Layla. Count 24 is aggravated assault. Charges Jennifer, November 17, 2015. Count 25, cruelty in the first. Charges Jennifer for November 17, 2015. Count 26 is aggravated assault, charging both Jennifer and Joseph with a date range of October 20th to November 10. And count 27, cruelty in the first, charging both defendants with a date range as well of 10/20 to November 10. I believe that Dr. Darrisaw testified that the injuries were both acute and subacute injuries, meaning that they occurred on different dates, and that the acute injuries would have occurred on the day of death. As to the subacute injuries, there's not a specific date that we can attribute it to. However, that is the reason for the date range. And I believe that would encompass any previous subacute injuries.
Any response? Motion is denied.
The next four counts, 28, 29, 30, and 31, reference the injury to Layla's buttocks. Count 28, aggravated assault, charges Jennifer on November 17 of 2015. Count 29, cruelty to children, defendant Jennifer, November 17, 2015. Count 30, charges aggravated assault as to Jennifer and Joseph, November 15 of 2017, and cruelty to children in the first degree, charging Jennifer and Joseph, November 15 of 2017. I believe as to counts 28 and 29, the evidence was from Dr. Darrisaw that the injuries were a few hours old, and I believe the information as to counts 30 and 31, if I'm not mistaken, I might have to go back and look at this, came from Darrisaw and Dr. Mesner, but if I need to go
Any
back.
response?
There's been no evidence that Joseph was anywhere near the children on November 15th either. To commit cruelty to children against him, he'd have to be present, and there's absolutely no evidence that he was present November 15th.
Motion is denied as to those counts.
The next two counts are 32 and 33. Count 32 is aggravated assault. Jennifer and Joseph was charged with a date range of October 20th to November 10th. This was blunt force to the child's arm in an unknown manner. And then count 33, cruelty in the first, charges Jennifer and Joseph with blunt force to the child's arm in an unknown manner. The date ranges are October 20th to November 10th on both of them. There were injuries to Layla's arms at the time of autopsy. We're not talking about the fractures, but the bruises. We know from previous testimony from specifically Dr. Duxbury that on 10/20, when he did examine the child, he didn't see any bruises to her arm, which is the reason for the date range being between October 20 and November 10 of 2015.
Any response?
Again, Joseph was not, there's no evidence that Joseph was anywhere near the children at that time.
Motion's denied as to those counts.
Counts 34 and 35 charge both Jennifer and Joseph. Count 34 is cruelty in the first, October 20th to November 6th. This is for fracturing Layla's left arm. Count 35 is aggravated battery, again charging Jennifer and Joseph between October 20 and November 6th, again fracturing Layla's left arm. We have testimony from Dr. Darrisaw that those injuries were approximately 2 weeks old. According to Dr. Duxbury, the injury was healing and it was 3 to 4 weeks old. And according to Dr. Manny, it was as well approximately 2 to 3 weeks old. I also have Dr. Evans indicating it was 3 to 4 weeks old. So those are all within that time frame. Could not narrow it any further, but they all agree it was a healing fracture.
Any response?
Same response, no.
Motion's denied as to 34 and 35.
It counts 36 and 37. 36 is aggravated assault, charging both Jennifer and Joseph. Again, a date range of October 20 to November 10, blunt force to the child's leg in an unknown manner. Count 37 is cruelty in the first. Jennifer and Joseph are charged with that date range of October 20th to November 10 of 2015. This evidence comes from the testimony of Dr. Mesner. He had indicated on Layla's legs, specifically in her inner right thigh and the back of that right leg, that there was hypopigmented marks that were consistent with a belt buckle, and that clearly they had to be older than 10 days.
Any response?
Stand on our motion and the previous responses.
All right. Motion's denied as to those counts.
The next two counts are 38 and 39. Both defendants are charged in both counts with a date range of October 17, 2015 to October 19, 2015. It's the same date range for count 39, aggravated battery, October 17 to, I mistyped it. Let me look at the indictment really quickly. Okay. Count 38, the date range is October 17 to October 19, and the date range for count 39 is October 17 to October 19. So same date ranges. And this is for fracturing Layla's right leg. We know from the testimony that when Dr. Duxbury saw the child, the visit was on October 20th. According to defendant Jennifer, the injury happened October 15th or October 16th. Christina Lowe saw the child October 19th, so it had to happen before that date. And then Mr. Coppinger said that when he saw the child, defendant Jennifer Rosenbaum indicated the injury occurred October 18th. And then according to Dr. Manny, those injuries, that injury to the right leg was a few weeks old. So that encompasses that date range.
Any objection to 38? I should say response to 38 and 39.
Same responses by no.
Motion's denied as to 38 and 39.
And count 40 and 41 I'll discuss next, and that is cruelty to children in the first degree is to count 40. Charges both defendants for fracturing Layla's rib between October 20th and November 6th. Count 41 is aggravated battery. Charges both defendants between November 20 and November 6th of 2015. And that again is fracturing Layla's ribs. We just heard from Dr. Darrisaw that was a healing fracture. It was 2 days old, and it was caused by blunt force trauma.
Response?
Same response, Your Honor.
Motion's denied as to those counts.
As to count 42 and 43, it's cruelty to children in the first degree, charges Jennifer and Joseph between the dates of October 20 and November 6. And this charge relates to Millie for fracturing Millie's left arm. Count 43 is aggravated battery, charges both defendants, date range November 20 to November 6th, and they're charged with fracturing Millie's left arm. According to Dr. Duxbury's testimony, her injuries were to the left arm. It was a healing injury. It was 2 to 3 weeks old, and it's not consistent with, according to the experts, it's not consistent with an injury in gymnastics with hitting the knee to the arm. So I believe there's sufficient evidence to go to the jury as to counts 42 and 43.
Response.
Same response, Your Honor. Stand on the motion.
Motion's denied as to 42 and 43.
Count 44 and 45 are next. That has to do with Millie again. Both defendants are charged. Count 44, aggravated assault, charges Jennifer and Joseph on about November 15, 2015, caused blunt force to the child's head and neck. Count 45 is cruelty to children in the first degree, charges both defendants on November 15, 2015, with blunt force to the child's head and neck. We heard from Dr. Mesner as well as Ms. Kelly Jimison that those were injuries to a protected area. In fact, I believe it was Dr. Mesner who testified that it's less than 0.2% of cases where that would be an accidental injury, and therefore he concluded that it was caused by blunt force trauma.
Any response?
Just again, there's no evidence that Joseph was present at any of this.
Motion's denied.
As to counts 46 and 47, those apply to Millie. Aggravated assault is count 46, charges both defendants, November 15 of 2015, with blunt force to the child's buttocks, hip, and back in an unknown manner. Count 47, cruelty to children, charges both defendants on that same date with blunt force to the child's buttocks, hip, and back. We have testimony from Millie that the defendant, Jennifer Rosenbaum, would strike her with a belt. Dr. Mesner testified that the injuries to Millie's right side on that area is consistent with a belt, and it is not consistent with a fall, an accidental fall, or any type of gymnastics injury. So I believe there's sufficient evidence on those two counts to go to the jury.
Response.
Stand on the motion.
Motion's denied as to 46 and 47.
Count 48 is cruelty in the second degree. It charges Jennifer and Joseph between the dates of October 20 and November 15, cruel and excessive physical and mental pain by failing to seek necessary and adequate medical attention for Layla. There's numerous occasions where they failed to seek medical attention. I think the one that came up the most during this trial, and it's probably most prominent on people's mind, was the injury to her leg. That injury, there was a lot of delay in seeking attention, and the doctors testified that that injury to Layla would have been painful. As to, well, I can move on to count 49, or we can...
Continue to 49, please.
49 is cruelty in the second degree. It charges both defendants with, between October 20 and November 15 of 2015, causing cruel and excessive physical and mental pain by failing to seek necessary and adequate medical attention for injuries to Millie. And we do know that Millie suffered a broken arm. There was no explanation that was given that could account for that injury. Millie also had injuries to the side of her body, to her hips and buttocks, and she indicated it was painful, it hurt, the bruises, and that her arm hurt when she went to the hospital, and at no time did she ever go to the hospital to get treatment for her arm or any of her injuries.
Response.
Stand on the motion, please.
All right. Motion for directed verdict as 48, 49 is denied, and that concludes our work as it relates to this issue. There being nothing else here at 5:20, let's go ahead and recess and or adjourn for the day. We'll come back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.